So hi again, this is the second recording on specific fallacies, namely violations of the burden of proof rule. And this is the second rule for a critical discussion. There are 10 in total, and these rules, if you abide by them, then in principle you can reasonably resolve your difference of opinion. But if you violate them, as we'll discuss now, then you commit a fallacy because you're unreasonable. And it doesn't matter which rule you violate of these critical discussion rules, it always results in a fallacy. Okay, now specifically to the burden of proof rule. The burden of proof rule reads as follows: a party who puts forward a standpoint may not refuse to defend it if asked to do so. And this makes sense. I mean, if you claim something, you have to defend it. That's how it goes. It is something we do in practice. It's actually also a legal principle called affirmanti incumbit probatio. So if you affirm something, claim something, it incurs, well, the burden of proof, actually. So you have to provide arguments to show why your claim holds. And so it is reasonable to say that people should do this in a discussion because otherwise they cannot resolve their difference of opinion. Now, it can also go wrong with this rule. You can violate it. An example of that you can see here. So we have a discussion between A and B, and A very wisely says that Leiden University is the best in the world. Now B casts doubt on this standpoint. B wants to know why A thinks so. And A says, well, give me one reason why that wouldn't be the case. Now, B wasn't really convinced of the fact that Leiden University is the best in the world, but A here doesn't really contribute anything to convince B after having requested more argumentation. So what we can actually say here is that it goes wrong. It's clearly a violation of this rule 2, this burden of proof rule, and I can tell you that this would amount to the fallacy of shifting the burden of proof. Now, to explain why this is the case, let's take a look at the situation here. So A and B have a discussion, and we can say that they have a non-mixed difference of opinion. A is the protagonist here, having a positive position towards the proposition that Leiden University is the best in the world. B is the antagonist, but a doubting antagonist, so B has a neutral position towards this proposition. So then, because B has a neutral position, of course, B also doesn't have the burden of proof, so that A requests B to put forward arguments is simply unreasonable. It shifts that burden of proof. Okay, now, if we have another discussion situation, for instance, when B actually says that Leiden University is not the best in the world, then we have a mixed difference of opinion. A still is the protagonist here, but instead of in the other situation, B is also a protagonist of the opposite standpoint. And that you can visualize in this way. So B adopts a negative position towards the proposition. Now I left the question marks in here in this visualization because, of course, if B has a negative standpoint, this immediately implies doubt on the positive standpoints towards this proposition, and vice versa. So that's left in. So if A now responds to B by saying, give me one reason why that wouldn't be the case, then actually it's quite reasonable for A to do so. I mean, B has this burden of proof since he has a negative position towards the proposition. But then there might arise a problem of ordering, because who goes first? Now, in principle, think about this question. What do you do in real life? I mean, just in everyday argumentation. In principle, I would guess you will follow the principle of presumption, which means that the party who goes against the status quo, so goes against the current state of affairs, that party starts with arguing. So presents argumentation first. And usually, I guess this is the protagonist. I haven't researched this, but It's probably the one who, in the first place, advances a standpoint. Okay, sometimes, however, this principle doesn't hold, and those are situations in which it's really difficult to defend your standpoint. Then what would be the course of events is that you follow the principle of fairness, which reads that the party who can most easily defend the standpoint, they start to argue their case. And in the book, they also give an example of this, for instance, in court cases, discussing alimentation. It might be the case that someone thinks that the ex-partner actually earns more than he or she said so, and so that in principle you actually have the right to get more alimentation. You go to court because you can't discuss this reasonably with your ex-partner, and in that discussion it is fair actually to make the ex-partner start showing why he or she didn't earn more than at the time that the alimentation was set, because the other party, the protagonist in this case, cannot look into the bank accounts of this and into all these privacy regulated kind of financial statements of this ex-partner. So it's fair to make the ex-partner start the defense first. The defense first. Okay, so I hope this is clear. In any case, let's return to the burden of proof rule, because now you have seen that at least there's one way to violate this rule, and that is by shifting the burden of proof. But there's another way, and that is by evading the burden of proof. And evading the burden of proof occurs when you simply don't provide argumentation when you're asked to do so. So here a question for you. I took a tweet from Joe Biden. He says, "Let me be clear, no one is expendable, no matter your age, race, gender, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or disability." And here comes his main standpoint. He says, "No life is worth losing," to add one more point to the Dow. So it's really a current example. He says, okay, we don't have to sort of be lenient in our approach to the coronavirus in order to get financial gains. No, it's all about every person's life. Then there's a critical reply, I could say, by this anonymous Twitter person. I can reveal this much. She says, "How much did they pay you to say that?" So that's already some kind of attack here. But then, interestingly, she says, "We know in your condition that you didn't think of that on your own. Geez, stop extorting Biden already, people. It's obvious," so that's another nice one, "that he needs serious medical attention and it's elder abuse what you're doing." So some kind of allegations going on here, but I took this example because here it's interesting that this person, she says, "We know this, it's obvious," but doesn't really give argumentation for why Biden needs medical attention and why he couldn't, in his current condition, say this, why that's impossible. So in fact, we can say here that this is an example of evasion of the burden of proof, because it's likely that Biden, for instance, doesn't agree with this, or Biden supporters don't agree with this. So there might likely be a request for further argumentation. You should know, by the way, that, I should do this, how much did they pay you to say that is also quite dodgy. It's a personal attack. It doesn't go into this statement here by Biden, which is his main standpoint. So in fact, we could say this is fallacious as well. It's irrelevant, an irrelevant personal attack. So if you've watched the first video on specific fallacies, on Rule 1 violations, you know that this is an ad hominem fallacy, specifically one of the circumstantial variants, and that's when someone's motivations are made suspect. So how much did they pay you to say that? he isn't, he's biased in claiming this because he was paid. Anyway, that's for another video, so let's continue here. A last example about the burden of proof. Look at this discussion contribution. I'm sorry, but I can't meet you today, is the main standpoint. And then this person says, I have a cold and it's obvious that given the corona crisis, it's really best to stay at home. Now maybe it's multiple crises, but I think maybe I should do this, given the corona crisis. Anyway, it's really best to stay at home. Now, is this evading the burden of proof? Is this fallacious? Because we have it's obvious here, and given the corona crisis, so it might seem like a violation of the burden of proof rule. Now, I think it's not actually. So this is not a violation of the burden of proof rule. Why not? Because arguments are provided. This person has a cold and there is a crisis. And more importantly, maybe, there's no likely request for further argumentation or no real request. I mean, there's no B replying with why is that? So maybe A, this discussant would then really have provided more arguments. So this is, I would say, not a violation of this rule. And that's something I want to end with. So it's maybe, appealing to call many instances of sort of the last arguments in a discussion to see them as violations of the burden of proof rule because they're not supported. So this person is evading the burden of proof, but be careful with that. So be a little bit conservative in that sense, because if there's other arguments provided or if there's no real request for further argumentation, then it goes too far to see that really as a fallacy of evading the burden of proof. Okay, so I hope this was clear, and let me know one way or another via email, discussion board, or in other ways if you have any questions. And for now, thank you very much. There will be other clips coming up soon, so stay tuned.